Just before you listen to today's episode, this is a quick message to remind you that if you like what you hear, you can help support History Hack, which is run entirely by volunteers using our Patreon account. There are links on all of our episodes, or if a subscription is not your thing, you can also now drop us a line on Ko-fi, which is just the equivalent of buying us a drink. So if you hear an episode, you like it, and you want to chip in just once, then you can do that too. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. You've got Alex and Zach on with you today because our guest is that person in the schedule where we just go, nobody else is having this, that's us. Everybody else can naff off. Who have we got, Alex?
Yeah, we absolutely do that. I think I've had a couple of prods like, oh, next time he's up. No. Right. In 1638, the ruler of Japan ordered a crusade against his own subjects. A holocaust upon the men, women and children of a doomsday cult. The sect was said to harbour dark designs to overthrow the government. Its teachers read and wrote a dead language that was impenetrable to all but the innermost circle of believers. Its priests preached love and kindness, but helped local warlords acquire firearms. They encouraged believers to cast aside their earthly allegiances and swear loyalty to a foreign god emperor before seeking paradise and terrible martyrdoms. Is this sounding familiar, Zach? The cult was in open revolt, led, it was said, by a boy sorcerer. Farmers claiming to have the blessing of an alien god had bested trained samurai in combat and proclaimed that fires in the sky would soon bring about the end of the world. The shogun called old soldiers out of retirement for one last battle before peace could be declared in Japan. For there to be an end to the war, he said, the Christians would have to die. Because yes, I'm talking about Christianity, because we don't care about pissing people off on History Hack. That cannot possibly be true, but it is. That's the cover blurb for the book Christ Samurai, the true story of the Shimabara Rebellion by Jonathan Clements. Returning to History Hack once again after episodes on Chinese food, the Pirate King of Taiwan, Confucius and Kublai Khan. He is the author of many books on the Far East, History Hack's dedicated Far East correspondent, and the presenter of 3 seasons of Rude Awakening for National Geographic. But surely this time you're just making shit up, John.
You've got me. This is all completely untrue. No, this is all true, I'm afraid. I was working on my book about the Pirate King of Taiwan, actually, and this started off as a footnote in that, because there's a very unreliable history of the Manchu invasion of China by a guy called the Reverend Palafox. And just in this aside, he goes, oh yeah, and the Pirate King of Taiwan, he had a sister, and she was one of the Christian rebels with her Portuguese husband in Japan, and they had to be evacuated by the pirates, and they went to China. And I was like, hang on, what Christian rebels? And that's when it all started. Because the story of the Shimabara Rebellion is incredibly well known among Japanologists. Actually, I was a bit of a dick for not spotting it myself before.
But you've done what we all do at publishing, which is go in and go, I've got something new and brilliant to tell you.
Well, actually, this was a story that was incredibly overtold in the 19th century, and we'll get to that later on. And so what you have is this really odd bias issue within publishing and within academia as well, which is that we have several generations where people go, not touching Shimabara, not worth it, been done. And so for about 50 or 60 years, no one talked about it at all, because it was one of the first things that people kind of dashed in to write about. And so it's only really now that we're seeing more people writing about it again, because in that time the works that have been written about it have kind of gone out of date or gone out of copyright, so no one can profit from them anymore, or various other things have happened to them. So it's a thing where I went to the publisher and pitched it, and they were like, oh my god, this is amazing, no one's ever talked about this before. And I was there going, well, actually about 50 people have talked about it before, but they're all dead.
Yep. Excellent.
So rewind a bit for us. How does Japan end up with any Christians to start with? Because I thought that this kind of wasn't their thing.
It's not their thing, and it still isn't their thing. I mean, in fact, it is a truism that there are more Christians today in Iraq than there are in Japan. And that should give you an idea of just what a small percentage of the population it is, and indeed was. But Japan did go through a period which has been called the Christian century by historians. And it's the trouble with the term Christian century is that was the name of Charles Boxer's book about it in the 1950s, and it was titled by his publishers above his opposition. He actually hated the idea of a Christian century because he thought it was prescriptive and limiting, and he didn't like it. But that's what we're stuck with now. So for about 100 years, from the time of the first Christian missionaries to arrive in Japan to the time when everyone was executed, you have this period. So it basically begins about 1543, because that's when the Portuguese show up in the very, very south of Japan on an island called Tanegashima. And so that's their first encounter with some of the samurai domains in this very, very southern part of Japan, which is far away from the center of things. It's where all the smuggling goes on. It has this sort of liminal contact with China as well. So they're hearing stories about these missionaries in China already. But the crucial thing with the Portuguese and eventually the Spanish is that when they show up in Japan, they aren't just telling stories about this lovely religion which can make everybody friends. They're also selling guns. In fact, the word for a matchlock musket in Japan was Tanegashima, because that was the island they were first discovered on when the Portuguese started flogging them. And so what you get in the later part of the 16th century is this sudden fad, this sudden trend for Christianity in Japan. And some of it is entirely cosmetic. You've got samurai walking around with crucifixes on like they're Madonna. Because crucifixes are in, and some of it is incredibly pragmatic and gimlet-eyed. You have lords, particularly down in the south, so around Nagasaki, Amakusa, Omura, converting to Christianity, taking Christian names, and telling the people of their domains that they are now all Christians. So you've got these mass conversions, thousands and thousands of people, all saying overnight, "Oh yeah, I'm Christian now." These lords become major power players in the ongoing samurai wars in Japan, because suddenly they've got this magic technology. They have artillery, they have gunpowder, they have arquebuses and matchlock weapons. And so the Christians, the Christian missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, because they're always interfering, the Jesuits. The Jesuits realize something which the Franciscans don't quite work out themselves, that the only way to deal with the Japanese is to convert the top. You can't walk around being nice to poor people in Japan. That's not how things work. You've got to go to the Duke and the Duchess, and if you get them to switch, they'll bring all their followers with them. And so the Jesuits are in very much at the top, sneaking around between these various lords who've all got these fantastic Christian names like Protesio and Andre and Bartholomew. And they all get involved in the various samurai wars, and that goes on right up until the great battle in 1600, Sekigahara, which unifies Japan finally under a shogun. At which point, people start to try and dismantle this suspicious foreign influence, because suddenly having these guys showing up selling you guns, telling how artillery works, is not some handy little bit of technology or some upper hand in the Civil War. Suddenly, this is dangerous, particularly when Christianity has an avowed allegiance to a foreign entity, because these are all Catholics. So they're all talking about how great the Pope is and how the Pope can organize crusades and the Pope can do this and the Pope can do that. And the shogun and ultimately the emperor demand the ultimate loyalty from their people. And the idea that there's some other guy that, on the other side of the planet who can tell them what to do is very unsettling for them.
How serious are these Japanese Christian converts?
Well, as I said, many of them seem quite frivolous at the time.
Yeah.
And there's a concept in Far Eastern missionary accounts called rice Christians, which is people who convert because they get free food.
Okay.
So and there are some very suspicious stories about that kind of thing going on.
Was it just me, or did anybody else just go Rice Krispies?
Yeah.
It was just you, Zach. And some of them, and there's some very suspicious behaviors as well. In 1580, the Jesuits write this very sheepish letter back to the Pope saying, we've accidentally become the lords of Nagasaki, sorry. And the Pope's like, what the fuck does that mean? And this takes a while for us to go backwards and forwards. So it takes until about 1582 for them to go, yeah, so Lord Bartholomew has given us Nagasaki to help us kind of, make some money. And the Pope's like, what do you mean make money? He goes, well, we've got to bring in all the silk and the guns and stuff, and we have to make tax on that because we have hundreds of thousands of converts that we have to administer to. And we had to set up the printing press, to make all the Bibles and stuff. And, one thing led to another. And he gave us a town. I hope you don't mind. And the Pope is absolutely infused. He's like, you're not supposed to be running a merchant empire from the middle of sodding Japan. I may be paraphrasing here, but you get the idea. However, the thing is that the really shocking thing for me still now, and also for many modern Japanese people, is some of them took it incredibly seriously. Some of them became incredibly and demonstrably devout. They started up huge charitable enterprises. They gave up fighting in a avowedly Christian way. And when the persecution started, they didn't do the easy way out. They didn't take the easy way out and go, okay, I'm Buddhist again, fine, whatever. They went to their deaths in a number of spectacular martyrdoms. And being Japanese, they often volunteered for it as well. That's the amazing thing, is that you have these stories of the kind of government inspectors breaking into a house and dragging people out going, you're a Christian, we know you're a Christian, we're going to take you away and torture you, and then we're going to execute you. And then their kids come running out of the house going, we're Christians too, take us. Knowing full well that they're going to be executed, often by crucifixion, in fact. So the seriousness of Japanese belief is something that is of great interest to a lot of modern scholars. Obviously, a lot of the people who write about this period are themselves Christians, and so they're fascinated by this. And there's a novelist called Endo Shusaku, who you will probably know as the author of the original novel on which the film Silence was based. And he became a Japanese Christian by default, really. His mother converted to Catholicism, and so he was baptized, I think, when he was about 10 or 11. And he spent much of his authorial career asking himself who these people were, because he said, I don't feel this. If you said to me, say you're not a Christian or we'll kill you, I'd just say I'm not a Christian. I'm not that bothered. But these people, for them, it was a matter of life or death. And they were very prepared to accept death. And so that's what Silence is about, and many of his other stories as well, is him trying to get to grips with what these people must have felt about their religious beliefs in order to be prepared to die for them.
So you've got all of these people who are kind of becoming really quite devout. What ends up turning the tide against the Christians?
Well, the real issue, well, there are several issues actually. Firstly, as the wars progressed in Japan, as Japan was eventually unified under a single ruler, the final battle was a kind of stutter in history. It was, oh, it's 1580, no, it's 1590, okay, it's 1600, now it's final. So there was this little bit of shuffling about at the top, and for the final samurai wars, and it's very clear that you get some samurai who are Christians on one side and some samurai who are not Christians on the other. And that becomes an increasingly sensitive issue, particularly with the whole popery that I mentioned. So you see several attempts to kind of downplay the importance of Christianity towards the close of the 16th century. In particular, there was a Japanese invasion of Korea by Hideyoshi, which quite conspicuously put all the Christians in the front line. They kind of rounded up, because Japan was supposedly unified, and we've got all these samurai with nothing to do, let's invade Korea. So they mounted this massive decade-long campaign against Korea, which was basically a crusade. It was basically the Christian samurai being told, if you can win land for yourself in Korea, fine, you go off and do that. And it was designed to keep the samurai busy, but I've always suspected it was also designed to kind of kill off as many of the Christians as possible. Some of them are getting older. They retired. They became what's known as kinor bushi, which is soldiers that return to the land in Japanese. And then in 1600, there was a huge battle at Shimabara, which is in 1600, there was a huge battle at Sekigahara, which was the battle that united the country. And basically, whatever side you fought on in 1600 determined your house's position for the next 250 years. and a lot of the Christians were on the losing side. And a lot of the southern domains, in fact, were on the losing side, and that didn't do them any good. And some of them lost their domains, or they were shuffled out, or they were told, "You should maybe, recant your Christianity, otherwise we may have to, do something horrible to you." The real issue, however, the real central issue, was a relatively minor event that happened in 1596 in an obscure place off the coast of Japan. And that was a shipwreck. The San Felipe was a merchant ship which kind of smashed into some rocks, and it was carrying silk. And it must have been an amazing sight, because all these different colored silks were billowing out of the hole in the ship and spreading out over the sea. And the locals, knowing a good thing when they saw it, kind of ran out in boats and started collecting it up. And after a while, the captain realized they were nicking it. And so in the fight that ensued between him and the local overseer, he made a series of very blunt threats about Christians. He said, "You don't understand, it's not just about the missionaries. The missionaries just come first, then it's the soldiers. And if you fuck with us, we are going to take stuff over, because that's what we've done in every other country." Oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And then suddenly you get the various rulers of Japan, because there's a kind of revolving door at the top at this point, saying, this guy is right. We've seen what's happened in other parts of the world. Maybe we should start clamping down on this. And so after 1600, so this is 4 years after the San Felipe incident, it's the Battle of Sekigahara. But after 1600, you get a generation where Christianity is increasingly clamped down upon. You get more persecutions. You get suggestions that maybe people don't want to do it, and then you get more persecutions, and then there are executions, and so you've got the shogun essentially saying, okay, there shouldn't be any more fighting now. Japan is safe. We've sorted out the whole war and stuff. So now we are going to turn into a police state for the next 250 years. You're going to have rigid provincial boundaries. And so the shogun's assertion of control was becoming increasingly powerful and increasingly more shrill, frankly, as the 1600s progressed. And so one of the real threats to him was the possibility that a boatload of missionaries could turn up at the wrong time and supply artillery to some lord who was feeling aggrieved. And so that's really what turned the tide against the Christians from 1600 onwards, and led to the kind of persecutions that I was talking about.
So I guess this is wrapped up then in what does the shogun mean when he says there will be no more wars? And does the cause of this that the Christians just fade away?
Right. Well, yes. In fact, one of the things that happened in this period is that some lords were dethroned, as it were, or shuffled around. And down in the south, because that was the heartland of Christian belief, there were some particularly strict lords put in charge, like the Matsukura family. And the Matsukura family had to take part in the demilitarization of many parts of Japan. Basically, one of the things the shogun said is there's going to be one castle per territory. I don't want 6 castles in someone's domain. We don't need that anymore. We need one central castle as the ruling center for my representative, and I want you to dismantle all the other castles. And the Matsukura family started building a mega castle. They started building Shimabara Castle, which was this immense tower in Shimabara, designed specifically to watch the coastlines. Because I've been to the top of Shimabara Castle, and you can look out and see the whole of the Ariake Sea. So it's great for looking for smugglers and so on. But this was a ridiculously opulent castle. It's massive, even by Japanese standards, leading the shogun to send a message, which Alex has just quoted: there will be no more wars. He's saying, this is a very war-y kind of castle you're making here. And
also, as well, how do you inflict that? Possibly by declaring war on someone and physically violently.
Yeah, you could bring an end to them being no more wars by starting a war, which I think is what the shogun was getting at. And the other thing is, of course, is that the Matsukura family were having to fund this from somewhere. And there are all kinds of suspicions that they were already involved in smuggling. But actually, they're also really heavily taxing the local peasants. The local peasants who were Kino Bushi, who were former Christian samurai who had gone back to the land. And so they were being treated like they were just a bunch of farmers that the Matsukura family thought they could slap around. And that's what led to the flashpoint that started the Shimabara Revolution, the Shimabara Rebellion, because the Matsukura's people were getting so persnickety about tax. There's one famous incident where one of their inspectors turned up and hacked a melon in half to get the last bit of tax required from the people he was beating. And of course, if people refused to pay their tax, they were torturing them, and they're saying, well, actually, you're probably Christian, so we're going to torture you now. There's a really horrible thing they did called the Mino dance, which is where they put them in a raincoat, which in Japan is made of sedge. It's like it makes you look like a haystack. And then they cover it in oil and set fire to you and sit there laughing while you rolled around, screaming. And so this is the kind of people that the Matsukura family were. And so even the shogun was faintly suspicious about their activities. And so it's this very political thing where if the Matsukuras fuck it up, they will be relieved of their command. They'll be packed off to somewhere else, and someone else will be put in charge. So the Matsukuras are under very heavy pressure to hunt down the Christians, to make sure there are no smugglers or missionaries around, to build a nice castle, but not one that's too castle-y, and basically to keep order in their province. And the threat of being relieved of their command is a big deal for them, because basically they're the 1% at the moment, and they will be taken off the 1% list if they turn out not to be good at their jobs.
So there's a rebellion. Is this because Matsukura's and the family's kind of oppression is worse than other parts of what's happening in other parts of Japan? And also, when it comes to the rebels, they're talking some pretty zany stuff, shall we say? So things like the prophecy, after 5 by 5 years have passed, see his sign in the sky, in east and west the clouds will burn. Dead trees shall put forth flowers to usher in the return of Christ. Are people taking this seriously?
Well, to deal with the first part first, was the oppression more serious than in other parts of Japan? The clampdowns, excuse me, the clampdowns on the Japanese were severe all over the country. They were deliberately trying to overwrite the last 200 years and make it impossible for there to be any more opposition to the shogun. So there was certainly a very severe degree of oppression going on elsewhere in the country, as there had been for decades. I mean, very similar prescriptions were pushed against a bunch of kind of anarchist Buddhists by Oda Nobunaga a couple of decades beforehand. So they were being treated quite badly all over Japan. I think the Matsukuras, for reasons I've just outlined, were particularly zealous because they were under pressure from both sides. They had this financial issue. They had the whole possibility of a fifth column of Christians anywhere in their domain because they were closest to the trade routes, and so therefore they were under particular pressure there. So maybe they were a little bit more zealous in their persecution of the locals, and there also may be a historical materialist issue here, which is that we know more about what was done to the Christians because Christian historians are more interested in that. So we have Crasset's History of Christianity in Japan, for example, which was written 300 years ago, but which details the kind of oppression of the Christians in that particular region. So that there may be a research bias there as well, but quite a lot of pushiness. The interesting issue, however, is how Christian the rebels were, because it's very clear that the initial impetus that started the rebellion off was taxation, was very poor farmers who happened to be Christian fighting back against the people who were stealing the last of their crops to fund a castle that no one wanted to be involved with. And so there's often suspicions among historians that Christianity was a very convenient smokescreen for the shogun to use to say, well, we've got to wipe all these people out. And we're going to wipe them out because they're fighting our tax laws, not because they happen to be Christian. So it may have been a really handy excuse, but it also may have been a handy excuse among the rebels. We have this sense that there's a committee of old samurai who are kind of running the rebellion. And it seems that they seeded the local area with anti-Christian comments by the people they were fighting in order to inspire other people to get involved. So you do get this sense with the rebellion that some of them were rebels and some of them were Christian rebels, and that's not necessarily the same thing. So as a case in point, you mentioned the prophecy, and it is crazy, and and I think it's a fake. I think this prophecy, the idea was that in 1614, one of the last Jesuits to leave the area under the shogunal persecutions left this prophecy behind, that after 5 by 5 years, a great youth will arise, and he will, he'll do this and he'll do that, and as you say, you'll see his sign in the sky in east.
It's just like, is this an element of the I'm gonna fuck them right up on my way out the door?
Well, no, because I don't think that Jesuit existed. I think that I think this prophecy was made up by the organizers of the rebellion and backdated to 1614, because although the prophecy's existence is bollocks, the things it predicts were all happening.
Okay.
So, for example, when you say we see his sign in the sky, the marshes around Shimabara put out huge tons of methane, which would kind of create St. Elmo's fire effects in the sky. And the new samurai who'd arrived didn't know that this was some kind of marsh gas thing, and they thought that they were kind of glowing lights in the sky, and so they were deliberately kind of saying, oh well, that's because of the end times, not it's because of the marsh, it's because of the end times. Unfortunately, land reclamation in the last 60 or 70 years in that part of Japan has completely removed all the marshes, so we can't see this kind of will-o'-the-wisp effect anymore. In east and west, the clouds will burn. I've mentioned before, I think, when we were talking about Kublai Khan, that there are these massive climate change issues during the late Middle Ages and the early pre-modern period. And one of these was spectacular sunsets. I mean, we were in the middle at this point of one of the 9 sloughs, which are these terrible fluctuations in climate, which created the same conditions in Manchuria that caused the invasion of China in 1644, just a few years later, because we're dealing with crop failure, we're dealing with famine and disease and floods, all the kind of things that would make the locals A, run out of money really fast because their crops are failing, and B, be more resistant to government oppression because everyone's suffering the same kind of problems. So we have these spectacular sunsets in the east and the west. The clouds will burn, and also trees were flowering out of season, because sometimes the fluctuation in climate meant that it was actually warmer than it should have been, and so trees that were supposed to be dead in winter were still putting out flowers. And so all of these things are, I think, observations from 1637, 1638 that have been retconned into a made-up prophecy to try and whip the rebels up into some kind of fervor.
So, this child Messiah, was he a real person?
Yeah, that's the amazing thing. There's a guy called Amakusa Shiro who used the Christian name Jerome. And he was the son of a preacher called Peter of Amakusa. And so they were instrumental in the rebellion. And Jerome was kind of set up as the kind of figurehead of the rebellion. And we have multiple conflicting reports about him. We know that he came from a family of minor samurai. We believe that he was an assistant to a samurai lord for like a page boy for some time. But that he and his father were kind of itinerant preachers. And the nature of preaching in that time was very performative. There's a lot of kind of conjuring and illusions, and we'll tell you a Bible story, but we'll also make this dove disappear, that kind of thing. And so he had a certain showman-like quality about him, even as a teenager. He was also supposedly incredibly beautiful, or, according to the other stories, completely disfigured by some kind of skin disease. And there was this kind of story that he'd bathed in the waters of Unzen, which are these hot volcanic springs in Shimabara, and he'd been cured. And this was, the doing of Jesus, and it was part of his spiel, really. So, Shiro Amakusa was the leader, supposedly, of the rebels. And we have proclamations written in his name. Some of them were wrapped around arrows and shot out of the castle when they were besieged. So we have proclamations that were written in his name, possibly by the real leaders, possibly by him himself, if he really was some kind of child prodigy. And we have a description of him coming ashore wearing a crown made of ramier grass, and a crucifix painted on his head, and this kind of white priest's robes, and all looking very very messianic. The degree to which he was the real leader or a figurehead is impossible to say, but he certainly seems to have been a real person, and he is the one that has really attracted popular attention in more recent times. You know, the 20th century stories, the manga, the films, the novels about the Shimabara rebellion often concentrate on this beautiful messianic youth who was supposedly the leader of everything. And the tone of his pronouncements is very interesting because they're written in Japanese, but they're peppered with Portuguese accented Latin. So there are lots of terms in the pronouncements of Shiro that are very clearly the words of a devout Christian believer who doesn't have Japanese words to describe some of the things like confession or penance, and is using Portuguese or Latin words to describe them.
So the samurai obviously need to deal with this, but to what extent is their response kind of hampered by their own rules and regulations?
The samurai are often their own worst enemy here. Firstly, because we have this revolt very, very far in the south, and the samurai aren't allowed to leave the boundaries of their provinces. So the initial military response to the revolt is a bunch of samurai from the province that is actually in charge, and they turn up and they're defeated by the rebels. The reason being that the rebels are not just a bunch of farmers who don't know what they're doing. They are veteran soldiers from the Korean War who are now who've still got their muskets from back in the day and are really good with it because they've been hunting with them for the last 20 years. And so they really surprised the samurai response. And there can't be another samurai response because the shogun's own rules say you can't cross the border. So even though, for example, Kumamoto is literally across the water from Shimabara, the samurai of Kumamoto are stuck there with their arms folded, staring out across the Ariake Sea at the fires on the horizon, and they are unable to respond until the shogun sends them an approval. But for that to happen, they have to send messengers all the way up to what is now Tokyo, get the approval, and come all the way back. And those messengers are coming back with messages of approval for all the provinces in between as well. So when the messengers come back to Kumamoto and say, okay, you can advance and put down this rebellion, they advance knowing that 20 other provinces are right behind them, speed marching south as well. Because that's the other issue, is that the samurai are pretty sure this is going to be the last battle that they see in their lifetime. This is your last chance for a battlefield promotion. This is your last chance for a medal. You know, we thought it was all over in 1600, but now we've got one more battle to fight. Many of them are quite young men, and they are absolutely clueless about what war is, and they think this is their big chance. They've been training for this for their whole lives, and now we can actually do it. So if you were born in the year of Shimabara, you're just kind of reaching the end of your operational prowess in 1638, and you are desperate for someone to see you on the battlefield being heroic. So there's this tidal wave rushing south to deal with the Shimabara rebellion. And they all kind of pile in almost at exactly the same time. And there's this kind of fight among them about who gets to be where, because the rebels have retreated to a place called Hara Castle, which is a very big decommissioned fort near Shimabara. And so we have like a dozen different houses bringing their own armies and all kind of fighting over who gets to be where during the siege and who gets to do what during the siege. And then you have the shogun's messengers going, is the siege done yet? Because how difficult can it be? And they're like, no, we're trying to sort it out. One of the samurai, very smartly, one of the leaders says, they can't live there forever on the food they've got. We really should just wait, and then no one dies. It's going to be nice and easy. But that kind of rather sensible, pragmatic approach isn't good enough for the younger officers who are like, no, I think I saw someone shooting at me over there. I'm going to go off and see if it's an enemy, and then immediately try and attack and start a conflict on the edge. So in many ways, yes, the samurai response, they turn into their own worst enemy. There are, in fact, accounts of the siege of Hara Castle of the attackers turning on each other about who has the right to get up the ladder first, kind of thing.
Oh my God. Okay, so you've given us some reasons why the siege lasted so bloody long in the first place. How does their food last for so many months? How does it last this long?
Well, the thing about Hara Castle is our image in our heads of a castle is, oh well, it's a few towers and there's like a shed in the middle or something. It's actually an island. I mean, it had silted up quite a lot by that point, and today it's completely connected to the mainland. But 100 years earlier, it was being referred to in samurai chronicles as Hara Island. So its defenses were in part caused by the fact that it was cut off by tidal waters twice a day. Some of the stories about Jerome include him walking on water, but actually you can literally kind of paddle across, and it looks like you're walking on water, but actually it's like if you imagine St. Michael's Mount and being trapped as you try and get away from it, and it looks like you're walking on water when you try and get away. It was also huge. I mean, it took me half an hour to walk across it, maybe longer, when I was there. The area of the castle now is big enough to have entire farms inside it. So you can grow your own food. There are wells inside. There are, and part of it faces the sea, so you can actually go and kind of harvest up shellfish in the shallows and go fishing and all kinds of stuff. So it can be remarkably self-sufficient for a very long time. However, as time went by, the thing is that there were 37,000 rebels. So it's the actual fighters and their families, and they're all kind of stuck inside this castle, which has multiple. So you can imagine there's a small wall around the very, very outskirts, but the castle part is much more strongly defended. But basically, you're on this kind of fortified area of farmland. When I went to Shimabara doing the research for my book, I stayed at an inn near the castle. And I don't know if you've ever been to a Japanese inn, but they're kind of socially cringeworthy, because you get this maid who kind of comes into your room with all the food and sits there watching you eat it, and it's all a bit difficult for a British person to cope with. So my then wife and I were sort of tucking into this meal of very, very Japanese meal of seafood mainly, and I was trying to talk to the maid because it felt odd having someone just sitting there looking at you while you ate. And she said, I know that you are here doing kind of castle-y stuff, so I've actually made sure that we've cooked you something that is from the siege. We've cooked you a local dish called Guzani, which is this sort of burner with a sort of broth in it of mushrooms and seaweed and a couple of bits of shellfish. And it was absolutely fascinating. I think it may well have been the beginning of my obsession with Asian food as a path into history, because it was so bland and so mundane and boring, but it was. And she said the thing about this is this is the food that the besieged Christians ate. And so I was kind of being transported back in time by this. But the thing is that I know what the sources are for the Shimabara Rebellion. I have an entire concordance of every single thing that's been written about it, and we don't have the menu from the rebels. We have the canteen menu for the samurai besieging them. We have the troop movements. We have the blacksmith reports. We have incredibly mundane and incredibly interesting and useful data sets from the besiegers, but we have almost nothing from the people in the castle. So I said to them, how do you know what they ate? And she went, oh, I don't, we just do, she said, and she got really nervous. And the reason is if you dig around in the research, you find out that the samurai themselves were trying to work out how things were going in the castle. And one of the ways they worked out how to do it was to rip open the bodies of some of the dead rebels that they'd killed on the wall and look in their stomachs to see what was there. And so the recipe for Guzani is actually a coroner's report rather than a menu.
That's brilliant. It's exactly like you're going to be sick. I think this is the most awesome thing ever. God, Zach, move it on before you yak.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give me a sec. Fucking hell.
I didn't realise you were that squeamish.
I'm not normally, but I mean that's quite extreme. Hey, why don't we just tear open a human being and then use that as the basis of a new regional dish?
It's brilliant. It's like, how are you still alive? Right, that's it. I'm gonna find out. Well, bring me a dead one. I'm going to find out how they're still alive.
It's clever.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but yeah.
It was
anyway,
the most unlikely historical source I was expecting to have to use, I have to tell you. But,
Yeah.
you know, one of those things about this.
I'm admiring the inventiveness, though. Let's move on. The Dutch get involved, don't they? So why do they go to war against fellow Christians on the samurai's behalf? Is that not a bit kind of counterproductive?
Slightly, yeah. So the Dutch are still around in Japan. The Dutch are the only white people who've actually been allowed to stay. And the reason is they're Protestants. They've made it very clear to the shogun that they don't do this Catholicism stuff. And that the Catholics are causing all the trouble in Europe, they say. We Protestants, however, we never cause any trouble. You can trust us. You can't see people of the interwebs, but Zach is wetting himself laughing with the mute button on. So the samurai have already said to the Dutch, okay, well, you know, prove it to us. This is a picture of the Virgin Mary or Jesus Christ. Walk across it. Prove us that you're not a Christian. And the Dutch go, well, fucking tap dance on it if you want. We don't care. It's just a picture. And so, as a result, the Dutch are trusted. The Dutch are permitted to stay in Hirado, and they're permitted to trade. And the Dutch have a little island called Dejima, which is their little ghetto, and they are permitted to trade there until 1700. I mean, they're there right the way until the end of the Dutch East India Company. And this image of Christ, or image of a saint or Virgin Mary, this is called a fumi-e, a trampling image, and that was used as the ultimate test to determine if someone was a Christian for hundreds of years in Japan. So the Dutch are minding their own business, and they hear about this rebellion, and they're like, well, luckily this has nothing to do with us, because it's just a bunch of farmers in Shimabara. And there's a knock on the door, and they go, guess what? It's not farmers, it's Catholics. Now's your chance to prove just how opposed to Catholics you are. And the Dutch leader is a guy called Nicholas Kukenbacker, who's like, for fuck's sake. Now what do we do? Now, Kukenbacker has already started to suspect that something like this is going to happen. He sent most of the Dutch East India ships out of their way, out of port to safety in Batavia or Taiwan, because he knows this is going to happen. But he's still got one ship left called De Riep, and Suetsugu Heizo, who's the kind of the head of Hirado, is banging on his door saying, I want you to take all of your warships, and I want you to get down to Shimabara and shell the shit out of that castle. And Kukenbacker's like, we haven't got any warships. Actually, the last one just left. I mean, what a coincidence. It's just gone. And Suetsugu says, I can see a ship from here. Take that fucking ship and get down to Shimabara. And Kukenbacker goes, but it's not really in our remit to kind of fight people. We're here as merchants. And they have this huge ding-dong about it. And we actually have Kukenbacker's letters back to Batavia explaining what happened and kind of excusing himself for doing this. So with great reluctance, Kukenbacker takes this ship and sails off to Shimabara. He takes his sweet time doing it. It takes, I think, 4 days. It should take a lot less time than that. But he's like, just go as slow as we can, for God's sake. Hope it'll be over before we get there. They get there. Nope, siege is still going on. So they start bombarding the castle. Now, the trouble is that the ships are low in the water. They're not warships. They are merchant men with cannon on them. And Shimabara Castle is, Hara Castle is very high up. It's on cliffs. They really need mortars, and they don't have any. So they kind of blast away for a bit. One of their shells actually goes over the castle, hits the samurai camp. And so the samurai are turning up on the ship and kind of saying, what are you doing? You're supposed to be shooting the Christians, not us. And the Dutch are like, well, it's very technical, very difficult because of the angles and stuff. I mean, if we were on land, it would be easier. And the samurai are like, fantastic. Move your guns off the ship, put them on land. We can see how you do this gunny thing. So now Kukenbacker is stuck moving his cannons onto the shoreline and firing them at this castle. And they maintain a constant barrage for quite some time. But one of their guns explodes and kills one of their sailors, which is a matter of extreme embarrassment to the Japanese. I mean, the Japanese are already aware that they've kind of drafted these people in to their help. And a number of reinforcements arrive. Some of the really big wigs of the samurai group arrive, and they are scandalized to see white people helping in this venture. And this is shortly after one of the guns has exploded and killed one of the sailors. So they're told, thank you very much for your assistance, but you can go home now. Sorry for the inconvenience and the dead guy and everything. Maybe leave a couple of the guns, that's fine, but you can go. And the Dutch kind of slink off with their tails between their legs. And so this new leader has arrived, and among the samurai, and he's very strict about these things. But he does say, I think it's time we brought this siege to an end. I think we don't want to do it with foreign help, so the foreigners can piss off. And so the Dutch interlude is just this kind of little moment, and they have been pilloried for this by Christian historians ever since. Particularly in the 19th century, people, when the Dutch are an easy target, you have some of the historians of the Shimabara Rebellion saying, well, it was nice of the Protestants to show up and show us just how much they care about other Christians. Said one nun who wrote a history of the Shimabara Rebellion. Kukabaka's argument was that he had no choice, that he wasn't even sure the people he was shooting at were Christian, and even if they were, he'd been ordered to do this, and it had been made very clear to him that if he had not cooperated with the authorities, then the Dutch themselves would have become objects of suspicion among the samurai authorities, and they might have lost this whole trade deal that they had.
I love this, because now you're not done yet. What's the stories of a ninja presence at the siege?
Oh yeah, because let's not forget the ninja. So the stories of the siege in later years have become riddled with tales of ninja, particularly the samurai from Kumamoto, who were a bunch of absolute nutters who were just desperate to use all of their supplies of gunpowder as quickly as possible. It's like if a wall blew up or something like that, everyone's like, was that Kumamoto again? Oh, for God's sake. So they had sappers, and they were digging underneath the castle, and then they were putting massive supplies of gunpowder underneath and then blowing it up. And so people say, well, the Kumamoto people obviously had ninja with them. But ninja, do not get me started on ninja. That's a possibility for an entire other history hack. But the short version is ninja were dreamt up by a couple of stuntmen in the 1950s, and the whole story of ninjutsu and ninja has been retconned into history in the last 50 years. In fact, the word ninja itself does not show up in an English-Japanese dictionary until 1974.
This is like these fictional machine guns at Gallipoli, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like fictional magic machine guns at Gallipoli that can jump over buildings. So, and my work on this book, for various technical reasons, I started this book in 2007, but it was only published in 2016. So, my work on this book was the first time that I was forced to confront this about the ninja, because in order to write it, I had to go back to the original sources, to the original samurai chronicles, of which there are dozens. And so every time the word ninja showed up in a modern history book, I went back and looked at the original source, and it wasn't there. So there would be, I think it was, oh yeah, they sent some ninja over the hill, and they checked to see what was going on, and then they came back and reported. And I go back and look at the original chronicle, and it says, we sent some scouts over the hill. And the word ninja just isn't there. It's the whole thing has been kind of shoehorned in by charlatans in the ensuing years. And popular history hasn't helped. There are all kinds of stories about kind of pulp fiction movies and stories and comics that just desperately try to put ninja into the story, and they're just not there. As they are not there in any other samurai tale.
So the siege ends up coming to an end. What breaks it?
What breaks it in the end, with a fantastic moment of historical irony, is that the most loyal lieutenant of Jerome betrays him on Good Friday.
Ouch.
I think Zach might need some medical assistance.
I think you've broken him.
He's laughing an awful lot. So a man called Yamada Emonsaku, who is one of the leaders of the rebels, realizes that this isn't working, and he has personal connections to the lords of Arima, who used to be prominent Christians, but who very publicly recanted their faith. And he manages to shoot an arrow letter out of the castle into the camp of the Lords of Arima. And so under the guise of discussing parley and possible treaty negotiations, he starts to meet Arima in the tidal beach area whenever the tide is out. And he offers to surrender. And he kind of reveals to Arima that there is this kind of weak spot in the castle, which he kind of shouldn't really have done. And so he offers to kind of betray them. But in fact, he is suspected by Jerome of having betrayed him. And so he's actually imprisoned in the castle, and he doesn't get to kind of deliver the final message. But the samurai attack anyway in this kind of massive assault. And the siege has been going on for months now, and it may well be that the thing that defeated the rebels in the end was starvation, because we've already discussed that Guzani is a kind of emergency ration food. There are 37,000 of them. They're running very low on food, and the description of the final battle of Shimabara is not that of brave samurai taking a stand. It's of starving people being massacred where they lay, and so. And that's one of the things about the Shimabara story that makes it such a problematic area in history, because there are Christian writers who would write about it, but they're not sure if they're Christian. And there are military writers who would write about it as a military event, but they're not sure if it's just a massive massacre rather than an actual fight.
What becomes of the ones that survive?
Well, officially, no one survives. Kukubaka himself noted that there were tales of rebels on the run, but officially 37,000 people were killed, and there was a massive pile of bodies left just to rot in the fields. However, this did not. This was an incident that was suppressed in Japanese history. The fact that the Shimabara rebellion happened was kind of gently. Discreetly swept under the carpet. No one was allowed to talk about Christianity. Every year, every new year, they would have these fumi-e ceremonies at various Buddhist temples around Japan, and all the people would line up, and it was this kind of big sort of party, and they'd have to walk across the trampling image to prove they weren't Christian. And so we have a haiku. We have a lovely little haiku from the time, from the 19th century, I think, and it's at the temple beneath peonies in full bloom, we trample on the face of Christ. And it's this big sort of party for everybody, because it's just a bit of fun, really. Every year we have to kind of line up and walk across this increasingly worn image of some foreigner. But the reason that this goes on is that the authorities suspect that there is still a Christian fifth column. They suspect that there is still kind of networks of Christians hidden. And every now and then the Jesuits would send an undercover kind of guy into Japan to try to minister to these undercover Christians. And we now know that there were, in fact, so-called kakure korishitan, the hidden Christians. And in certain remote communities, people were passing on Bible stories, passing on prayers by word of mouth, and secretly communicating Christianity. And over the years, that drifted further and further and further away from what it had originally been. But the hidden Christians actually survived right up until the time that the samurai era ended. In 1865, they built the foreigners built a church in Nagasaki to administer to the foreign community because Christianity was still a capital offense in Japan. And Father Petitjean was just closing up one night, and it was only like 2 weeks after it opened, and there were these Japanese people waiting outside, and one of them said, "Are you the priest?" And he's like, "Yes. What do you want?" Japanese person, and she says, "Our hearts are the same as you. Where is the Virgin Maruya?" And he's like, "Fuck me! It's true. They're fucking true." And so it turns out that these communities, like, scattered around, mainly around South Japan, have been secretly kind of worshipping in very kind of isolated and secretive states for the last 200 years. And so the hidden Christians are then kind of everyone is so excited about this. So much as what's written about the Shimabara rebellion is really about the hidden Christians, and it's really the 19th century when missionaries, and priests, and church representatives go to Japan and find these people and like, oh my God, now you can return to the faith. Although it turns out that many of the hidden Christians' beliefs had drifted so far from what the original was that it was considered they weren't prepared to go into a modern Christian religion because they didn't recognize it. Just to give you an example of some of the drifts that there are, we have these kind of nonsense chants from the hidden Christians. So and they would chant like Buddhists, so they go pa tiri no tiri ke senseria sentimo sentimo nomento wa, which doesn't mean anything. But if you kind of get forensic with what they're saying, it's actually pater noster qui in caelis sanctificator nomen tuum, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And they've got another one which is Ame Maruya Karasabino Domisu Tereki Binsu Tua Ishimode, which is nothing. It means nothing in Japanese. They just chanted this thing. But what they're trying to say is Ave Maria gratia plena Dominus tecum benedictus. So it's Hail Mary full of grace. And so we have these stories. They have their own Bible, which has actually been published in English. It's called The Beginning of Heaven and Earth. And it's kind of, and so you have the story of Jesus as told by word of mouth over 250 years. It's drifted very, very far off course. But what's fascinating about that is that for me to call it a Bible is to accord it with a degree of epistemological authority that it doesn't actually have, even among the hidden Christians. There's a guy called Stephen Turnbull, a friend of mine, who was doing his research, doctoral research among the Christians, the hidden Christians of Japan, and he because some of them are still, they call themselves hidden, but not hidden anymore, or are they? We don't know. But he was interviewing one of them, and he said, "I really want to talk to you about the beginning of heaven and earth, and the various stories that it contains." And the guy said, "Well, until you mentioned it, I'd never heard of it, but I went away and read a copy now, so now I'm ready to talk to you about it." And he's like, "No, I'm here as an anthropologist. I want to know what you know, not what you've learned. Oh God, you've ruined it." So it's a very, very kind of difficult area there. But I think you can probably see why the story of the Shimabara rebellion and the hidden Christians is such catnip to Christian historians.
To that end, why is Jerome Amakusa not a saint?
Well, there are a few Japanese saints from the Christian century, and there's a lovely little kind of monument to them in Nagasaki, and most of them are people who refuse to recant their faith under torture. But the thing that made them saints was their martyrdom. And the issue with Jerome Amakusa is we still can't be sure that his revolt was a Christian revolt. We don't have enough evidence from him saying that he was a Christian leader who advocated Christian causes and who died in odium fidei, in persecution for his faith. There is still a chance that it was just a bunch of tax rebels, and with that in mind, the church isn't prepared to rule that he meets the standards of martyrdom required, because it's quite a political issue there.
Yeah, right. So this story is huge in Japanese popular culture, isn't it? Is there not an entire book about the Christian century and modern Japanese fiction, complete with sorcerers, time travelers, and whatnot? Why is it so compelling to modern readers?
Yeah, and the crucial thing there is modern readers, of course, because this wasn't discussed until the 20th century, and suddenly in the 20th century you get this massive explosion of interest in it, and you're referring to Rebecca Suter's book, Holy Ghosts, which is a history of modern pulp fiction accounts of Christianity in Japan, which is absolutely mental. I thought I'd seen it all, and these kind of Christian wizards raising the dead at Shimabara and stuff. But she's got like ninja tracking down the vital Christian artifacts which are hidden in the vaginas of 7 magical maidens, all kinds of weird. Sorry.
Zach's awake now.
Yeah, Zach's suddenly woken up.
Suddenly he was like, vagina, what?
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, it's a compelling story, and I think there are several reasons for this, and one of them, which we have to acknowledge, is research bias, because when so many foreigners get interested in this story, it is often because they, by being Christian, they amount to people like us. They amount to people with whom we share some kind of common cultural identity. They're people in Japan who know who the Virgin Mary is, who know who Jesus is, and so there is this search for the familiar, which can really skew people's understanding of history. As I said at the beginning, there are more Christians in Iraq than there are in Japan, and so much research about Japan's Christian century finds ourselves, concentrating on a belief that only accounts for 1 to 2% of the Japanese population today. So everybody else is Buddhist or Shinto or whatever, and Christianity is an incredibly small fragment of that. However, it is exotic to the Japanese. And the Christian century is such an amazing period for the Japanese to talk, because it's what we call a John Bar hinge. History could have been very different if the Christians had won at the Battle of Sekigahara, or if the Christian rebels had somehow, held off the shogun's people. And so I think for the Japanese, it's an incredibly exotic and also romantic story. And when it comes to Amakusa Shiro, to Jerome himself, the fact that he was recorded in the chronicles as an incredibly beautiful boy, and the possibility that he was actually a catamite to a samurai in his younger days, means that the whole story of the Shimabara rebellion also has this kind of gay alternative angle to it. So, I mean, for example, when the Japanese did Jesus Christ Superstar in Japan, they did it in the style of the Shimabara rebellions. It's all these like kabuki people and samurai, and Jesus is this ridiculously beautiful boy, because that's how Amakusa Shiro is regarded. So in modern times, it is seen by the Japanese as this incredible path not taken. And the romance of the story is something that they really can't get enough of.
So, knowing that you will inevitably be back, because we can't get rid of you, and Lord knows we don't want to. Matt's dropped in for the next recording, and he's already like awestruck within like 4 minutes. How are you possibly going to top this?
There's all kinds of possibilities. I thought what I might offer you for the next history hack would be weaponized music in Japan, 100 years of sing-along of fascism.
Yes.
Done.
I'm in for that.
Yeah.
There'll be 3 of us on that one now.
Yeah, we just say that, like, no, his don't ever get let out to the Bastard Brigade for participation. It's like, hey, we're pulling rank.
Jonathan, it was another utterly bloody brilliant episode. Thank you. We're going to stick all of your books on the History Hack bookstore. People, go buy these books. You just get a flavour of, frankly, just how mental all of this stuff is.
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
I'm still recovering from that. I'm probably going to spend the whole day recovering from this one, but thank you so much. Come back again soon. And like I say, we'll stick all of your stuff on the bookstore. People, go buy it. It's brilliant. Jonathan Clements, you've been a joy as ever.
Thank you very much.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great